Hello, welcome to PQ, the one and only Pokemon Cube podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Martin, brought to you with co-host Connor Lavelle. Connor, welcome back for another episode of the Cube podcast.
I'm excited to continue. I'm excited to talk more about different topics. I know back when we originally kind of went on hiatus, we felt like there weren't quite as many topics as we wanted to go over. And so excited to have kind of a fresh bank that we want to talk about.
Yeah, you would think, in 3 years' time, we've gathered at least a few topics to go over, which is always good. I think this is an interesting time in the part of the competitive Cube time because it's kind of a lull. It's the same thing with like competitive Pokemon right now. We're entering into a new season of Pokemon, so and also a new season of Cube events. So if you're listening to this and you are wanting to participate in Cube events, we have a lot to talk about there. Connor, is there anything you're looking forward to coming up in this new season in the Cube Discord?
Yeah, a ton actually. I'm really excited to just get back to playing League and teams. Ojama's slight change this season. No spoilers just yet, but very excited to get into the new season and just play more Cube because it's been a little bit of a longer break than we've seen in the past, and so I'm really itching to get some competitive Cube going.
Yeah, and that's going to be kind of the focus of this episode today for our listeners. So we're going to be talking about how to prepare for the upcoming season, how to prepare for a Cube event. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in getting into these type of Cube events that we talk about on the podcast, you'll definitely enjoy this topic. We're going to help you go have the busted draft, have like the top cut on the first event back. So you definitely want to stay listening for that. We do have a Crack-a-Pack. This time we're gonna go. Last week we went mutant. This time we want to go traditional, and we're gonna go with high power. So we have this pack is from Blue 3 Cube. It's made by Blue Cheesecake. They spent a ton of time on this cube. I think out of everyone, at least active people I see at the Discord, I always see Blue Cheesecake making updates and is like always on this cube. So this is an awesome cube. Definitely check it out if you haven't yet. I'm gonna share the pack now. We have a couple different cards here, so I'll kind of walk through them. I bet like if you're listening to this and you've been playing in like the past 5 years, you'll be more familiar with the cards in this pack than probably previous ones because it does have a lot more. It has a mix of cards from the current era and then cards from maybe like the Sun and Moon and Sword and Shield, and also some older ones in there too. You see that twins, so I'll kind of walk through it and then we'll kind of get your thoughts and we'll figure out what the pick is here. So we have a 15 card pack here. We have the Zapdos from Team Up with Thunderous Assault. Does 10 damage, but if it comes from the bench into the active, it does 80. So for only 1 energy. We have Rockruff from Champion's Path. We have Sky Arrow Bridge from Nexestities that says the retreat cost of each basic Pokemon in play is 1 colorless less. And then we have Toxicroak from Sword and Shield base. It has the More Poison ability. I love that name. It says put 2 more damage counters on an opponent's poison Pokemon. Straight to the point. Then it's got Poison Claw for Darkness, double colorless, a 70. It says flip a coin if heads. Your opponent's active is now poisoned. We have the infamous Blacksmith supporter card that says attach 2 fire energy cards from your discard pile to one of your fire Pokemon. We have everyone's familiar with the Ultra Ball trainer card item. Discard 2 cards from your hand if you do search your deck for a Pokemon. Pretty good consistency. We have Greninja from Breakpoint, which says Shadow Stitching attack for 1 colorless, does 40 damage until the end of your opponent's turn. Each Pokemon your opponent has in play has no abilities. And then it has the Moonlight Slash, 1 for 60. You may return a water energy from this Pokemon to your hand. If you do, it does an extra 20 damage. And I mentioned the twins earlier. This is an older supporter from Triumphant from Heart Gold Soul Silver. You can only play this card when you have more prize cards than your opponent, and you can search your deck for any 2 cards. So pretty powerful counter or playing from behind card. We have Opal from Vivid Voltage. Flip 2 coins. Search your deck for a card up to the number of heads that you flip. Put them into your hand. We have a new card from Twilight Masquerade, Community Center. It says once during your turn, if that player played a supporter card from their turn, they may heal 10 damage from each of their Pokemon. So kind of like a counter spread card. We have Dratini from Unified Minds. There's the Cypher Maniacs Code Breaking, which came out in Temporal Forces, which is just like a Mallow It says search your deck for 2 cards, shuffle them, and put them on top of your deck. And then I guess we have the Pokemon version of that. We have Magcargo from Celestial Storm, which is a reprint of an older version. It says Smooth Over is the ability. It says once during your turn, you may search your deck for a card, shuffle it, and put it on top of your deck. And then it's got Combustion, 3 fire, double colors for 50. We have Professor Sycamore, similar to Professor's Research. Discard your hand, draw 7. A supporter card, very good. And then we have Big Charm from Sword and Shield, the tool card that gives your Pokemon an additional 30 hit points. So some context for our listeners who aren't familiar with this cube. It is a higher power cube. That means the tempo of games is a bit quicker. That means there are less turns than you would expect in a slower paced cube like the cube we looked at last time. So there's a few things you got to consider in terms of tempo and deck consistency. So Connor, as you're evaluating this pack, what are things that you're thinking about? And is there anything that has caught your eye?
Yeah, so the big things that I'm really looking at for high power are consistency pieces. That's always the king in high power if it's well balanced, because any line in high power should be good enough to get you knockouts. And so here, when I look at the pack, there are quite a few powerful consistency options. You know, there's Ultra Ball, there's Twins, there's Professor Sycamore, there's Cybermaniacs, Code Breaking. But the card that stands out as an incredibly powerful card in any environment, but especially in high power, where you have fewer turns and you really need to hit the cards that you need immediately every single turn. The Magcargo with Smooth Over, I think, is far and away the strongest card in the pack here, just because it guarantees that turn over turn, you are going to have the greatest ability to hit exactly what you need. There is the Zapdos with Thunderous Assault is also interesting to me. I think this is kind of a standout in terms of power level in the cube, just being able to deal 80 damage for a single energy on such a high HP. So maybe that's like either the cube has changed more than I realized over time, or that might just be a card that's a little bit too strong in the current version. But regardless, the Magcargo would be my pick.
Yeah, I love the Magcargo. It's such a strong ability. It's interesting too. Like we think about drafting the hard way and like committing to lines and stuff. And like Magcargo is just such a broken card that like taking it in your draft is just going to make your deck so much better that finding a Slegma after this is going to be like super easy. So this is like one of those instances where like you get like a really powerful Pokemon with an ability like that, and you just kind of snap pick it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting pack. This is going to be strong pretty much all the way around the table, but I do think the Magcargo is a big standout. After the Magcargo goes, I think it's a lot harder of a choice. Blacksmith can be a really powerful start to a deck. In high power, I'm not as afraid of getting into an archetype quickly because it enables you to spend the most amount of picks on the deck that you want to play, which can be very valuable in a super high consistency environment. But Sycamore could also be very good. Like the Zapdos that I talked about could also be strong. So quite a few different options after that Magcargo goes, but the Magcargo is definitely my number one here.
So let us know if you're listening to this, if you have any thoughts. Is there any other card that you're considering that you want to let us know about? Let us know in the comments. That said, stick around. When we come back, we're going to be talking about how to get ready for the next Cube League events. See you soon. All right, welcome back. So, as mentioned before in the intro, today we want to go into how to prepare for upcoming Cube events. Connor, you had a real interest in this topic. You kind of want to share your beginning thoughts on this?
Definitely. So this is a topic that I'm pretty passionate about, and an advantage that I think I've had in quite a few leagues and champs in the past. I think this is maybe one of my strongest advantages that I've had for champs past, at least one that can easily be replicated. So, definitely, I feel like the podcast in some respects has been an exercise in giving away advantages as a competitor, but this is something that I'm really passionate about and I'm excited to talk about. So preparation is one of the most powerful things you can do to give yourself higher odds of succeeding at a given draft. And so today we are going to talk about lots of different aspects of preparation, how I go about preparing for cubes, and then we will have a case study with our steps as well.
Yeah, so if you're looking to participate in any upcoming Cube events and want to see how we approach this process, definitely stick around towards the end because we'll be going through a cube like that we have not reviewed before. So this will be a very interesting episode for doing a cube review. So I guess we want to start with the beginning, the preparation and how the process works. So what is like your first steps when approaching a cube, especially like for an upcoming cube league or champs cube?
Sure. So there are some basic things that are some people kind of don't think about when they're reviewing a cube, and it can actually influence the way that you evaluate everything after you know those facts. So those pieces of information are what I've titled here as the basics. So first, read the rules. This is a really important part of any cube. Pokemon Cube very commonly, of course, has rule changes to create a certain gameplay experience or a different feel, and so reading the rules can tell you, what are the starting rules? Am I going to want to prioritize cards that work well with the starting rules? So, like if it's mutant and you can attack on the first turn, then you're going to want to prioritize strong turn one attackers a little bit higher and things like that. Um, and it can also tell you, it's very rare nowadays that there's a cube without a gentleman's mulligan, but they do exist, especially if you're playing with your local play group more. These are, the kind of standard rules that we see are not necessarily as common as they across the board, especially for less experienced groups. So knowing that there's not a gentleman's mulligan can influence maybe you take another couple consistency cards than you would normally, but sometimes it can really shape how you draft. So, for example, if you go into a draft of Latent Potential, which is the cube that I recently built that we talked about last episode, and you don't know that the energy types in a Pokemon's attack costs allow them to evolve into and out of that type, then you're missing a huge portion of the cube just because you didn't look at the rules. And so there are all kinds of different things, both big and small, where the rules can really be a huge factor.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at like a cube and I've gotten too far into it only to realize that like an interaction didn't work the way that I thought it did, or like there is like a whole another level of like cards because of like the rules. So I think it's always best just to start there just to get your frame of mind of what the cards in the cube are actually doing.
Exactly. And the second thing on my list of basics here, what's the power level of the cube? Power level will describe, the feel of the cube, but as a drafter, it will also tell you some things right off the bat. So in low power, a powerful attacker is going to be extraordinarily valuable because there are just few of them. They don't exist in great number in low power environments. And so if you see a powerful attacker, so like a Prowl Persian, for example, you wouldn't be super excited to play that card in mid or especially not high power because Prowl as a power is not strong enough to justify playing an entire stage one. But in a low power environment, the attack on Prowl Persian is very strong. And so suddenly that elevates the priority of that card to, in some environments, make it as much as a pack one, pick one. And so that's something that you need to consider. In a mid power environment, you know that you're going to have some time to set up, but you need to get a move on at some point. And then in a high power environment, you know that you're really just going to want to focus in on a single strategy. You're going to want to make it as consistent as possible, and probably want some weakness mitigation as your solution for the weakness matchup. But those are really the things that you want to think about, and they can influence the way that you draft significantly just based off of that power level alone.
So then like if you're someone who's very new to different cubes, like maybe you draft like, your cube or your friend's cube and you're trying to get into maybe cubes you see on the Discord, is there like an easy way to like evaluate a power level for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with cubes?
There are. It's a little bit challenging if you don't have a list in front of you. So if you're looking at the Cube Koga page, the Cube Koga page will tell you. Especially if you're preparing for one of these events that is run in the server. Every cube that goes to one of the events is going to have an accurate power level on it. So if you look at that, then you're going to have a good idea. But generally, if you see a lot of high numbers and high damage, high HP, high damage for low attack costs, then that's going to be high power. And if you see attackers that are going to take several hits to knock out opposing attackers, then that's generally going to be a lower power cube. Those are the really quick notes on how you can tell just at a glance, especially if you're playing just one of your friends' cubes at a table and you're trying to evaluate kind of on the fly. Then those are some of the things that you would generally look out for. But most of the time now, people will know what power level their cube is, and so you can just ask them. Or if you have the list in front of you, then it's a lot easier to determine. But the third thing in the list of basics is, are there any free cards? And that can also influence your drafting decisions quite a bit. So, Archetype Cube is another example that we can pull from. It's one of the first cubes that gave the SP basics to the people who drafted their level X's. So, if you don't know that the SP level X's give you the basics for free, then you might evaluate that archetype completely differently, because now it's no longer this super efficient deck that you can spend a lot of other picks on making strong. Now it is, okay, I'm basically drafting a stage 1 deck that is a little bit more finicky than a normal stage 1 deck, and I still have to take all my normal picks. And so there could be a really strong deck out there that you're maybe not aware of, that you could really get into a lot more effectively given the knowledge of free cards. Another example is, and I think this is probably going to be removed based on some conversations that I've had with the builder, but Ditto Prism Star in Mix and Match is a tremendous addition to the draft pool that you get for free. And so that can allow you to, for example, take a Delcatty and not need to worry about getting the Skitty because you already have a basic for that line. And so different things like that, even single cards, can make a massive difference in how you build your deck and how you prepare for the draft.
Yeah, only thing I'll add here is I it kind of ties in with point number one about looking at the rules and then are there any free cards. There's like a style of cube out there called a shop cube that we see pretty common that kind of fits in with both points there, that you want to check for things like that as well. Like, are there things that are going to allow you to get like extra cards in like a shop? And then are there special rules or special cards in the draft that will benefit from those? So cube builders sometimes like to implement some people call them gimmicks. I don't have a better word for them, but but like custom features in a cube that you just want to be aware of, because that can also influence how you approach certain cards. Like, do I take a basic if I know I can get that for free, or like those are kind of things you also want to look at contextually when you're evaluating a cube.
Absolutely. And so, and one other thing that I wanted to call out too, in a lot of newer or a lot of cubes that are built for less experienced players, you'll get the basics in stage ones free with the evolutions, and so that can also be a huge difference in how you might choose to draft. But usually, you'll notice if you're not seeing any basic Pokemon in the draft, so you'll get there one way or the other on that one. But those
That'd be a pretty tough draft with no basics.
yes. So those couple of additions, the shop rules. Sometimes there are Rochester drafts where you get another couple of free cards. Basically, oftentimes the Rochester draft cubes will have some very powerful cards in that Rochester, so you can, count on getting a couple of good consistency cards from that. And so, yeah, definitely to Andrew's point, there are quite a few things to consider when it comes to free cards. And so, all of these steps that we've talked about already, we haven't looked at the cube list at all. And I think that's really important to not get too deep into the cube list before you read the rules. Really start with the rules and understand what you're working with, because it will change how you evaluate lines to such a great extent. So if you start evaluating the lines and then you're like, oh, let me go back and check the rules, then you're going to have to go back and look at those cards that you've already checked again in some cases, because you might discover things that you didn't know otherwise. And so that's just another thing to think about when you're doing this preparation, is starting with those basic things, the rules, the power level, the free cards, and then getting into the list. And for the list, we have several steps again, and this is definitely more in depth than the basics. But the first thing that you want to do is check the lines. Go through the Pokemon and look at what the Pokemon are doing by themselves. And so the things that I'm oftentimes looking for in lines are the overall strategies and archetypes, and a lot of the time what that breaks down into is engines and payoffs. The being able to accelerate different types of energy, or needing a certain volume of energy to be able to execute a strong attack. So these are things like, oh, well, Firestarter Blaziken is really critical for the fire deck to be successful. So I really don't know if I want to be in the fire deck if I don't already have the Blaziken, because somebody else might take that Blaziken and use it in their line instead, because the generic acceleration is powerful in other decks. Or I've got this Lugia EX. I think it's really strong, but how can I make it attack? How can I get to that Elemental Blast for the knockout as reliably as possible without having to just manually attach 3 energy? Or can I play a deck where I will actually have the ability to manually attach 3 energy to the Lugia? A lot of the time, that's going to be in cubes where you have very efficient top end attackers that only take like 1 energy, and then you have a bunch of free attachments out of that. So you can take advantage of those attachments by setting up a powerful secondary attacker as well. So engines and payoffs are really the big things that I'm looking for in terms of strategies. And throughout this, you want to be thinking about relative strength. So if you look at the grass line and it deals like 3 for 70, then the fire line deals 3 for 100, then the fire line looks a lot more appealing. Even if the grass line might have some cool synergies in it, you really want to be considering, if you are able to execute the strategy of your deck, assume that you are going to be able to execute the strategy, then what are you going to get for that strategy?
Yeah, I think payoffs is a pretty big concept. I know one that like I really kind of leveled up my game when I started to understand that like you got to have like it has to be worth it for a card to like if it does 100 damage, how are you getting that energy across, and is that energy meaningful and producing something that is going to make your deck you know dangerous or above rate? And I think like that's something that even cube builders can look at too. It's like if you're looking at your lines and you have a grass line that's doing 70 and the fire line's doing 100, but what is the grass bringing to the table? It's not just a numbers game, but is there value in what you're doing in a certain line that you're able to pull off? I think that's like when you're looking at a cube, you're kind of looking at that like, okay, what am I getting value wise, and how can I get the most value out of what I'm drafting?
And building off of that as well, let's take an example. So a Torterra line is pretty common in mid-power cubes. And if you're just looking at that Torterra line in a vacuum, then you look at it and say, oh, well, this line has a lot of synergies with having a lot of energy in play. It has high attack costs. It deals pretty good damage. It has a lot of HP, but I'm not going to be able to attach enough energy to it in time to be able to get good value out of it. And so you might consider Torterra pretty weak. But then you look at the rest of, we'll say, the grass line in particular, but there are definitely cases where you're getting acceleration from some other type or some other line. And you look at Torterra and you say, okay, well, actually, this cube has Celebi Prime. In Mix and Match, we used already, there was Blessings of the Fluff Eldegoss, which can attach 3 grass energy from the deck. A little bit too powerful, I think, but it was a really good example of the kind of effect that can make your Torterra line extremely powerful and kind of mitigate those weaknesses. So the Torterra there is the payoff, and then you have a different engine to support that. And I think a lot of the time when we see new cube builders who are familiar with Pokemon, so sometimes we'll see not cube builders, but deck builders, new cube drafters. A lot of the time we'll see a player come in who knows Pokemon. They come from Standard, or they played in the past, or something to that effect, but they haven't cubed before, or they haven't cubed much, and so they will put together a deck that is either all engine or all payoff. I think we've seen these decks a ton. Andrew, I'm sure you've seen these decks a ton, but the all engine deck, I think, kind of iconically is oftentimes a Typhlosion or a Blaziken deck that just has the fire starters and the afterburners, and you have so many different ways to get energy in play, and then the energy doesn't go anywhere. You're just attacking with Typhlosion at the end of the day, and the Typhlosion isn't set up as an attacker. It's just there. You can attack with it, but you don't necessarily want to. And so you want to be using that energy to do something more powerful a lot of the time, and not just focusing on the attacks with the Typhlosion. Typhlosion in that case is the engine. On the other side, a deck that's all payoffs. This is a deck where you have essentially, you have your Torterra deck, but your Torterras have no way to get energy in play. And so you just have a deck full of payoffs, and you have no way to enable those Pokemon to be powerful. So that's both a deck building tip, but it's something that you can really take advantage of in planning as well. Um, if we talk about something like coin flip cube, where it's I think the draft for coin flip cube is very challenging even for experienced drafters, but for new drafters it is very very challenging to overcome some of the, you're both evaluating all these trainer cards that were previously much weaker, or cards that you've never seen before, and then there are also a ton of different intricate synergies across lines, and so there's so much that you have to think about as a drafter in that cube. And so if you have done the preparation for the cube and okay, so unknown Y, I don't have to be playing an unknown deck for unknown Y to be good because there's Mismagius, there's Delta Mewtwo, there's Shaman from Unleashed, and all those Pokemon will move those energy off. And so suddenly unknown Y becomes a very high priority card. Whereas if you're looking at the cube and drafting it for the first time and you haven't done that preparation, you would never know that. You would just see unknown Y, and it's okay. It searches your deck for a psychic energy and attaches it to an unknown. That's not very strong. It doesn't really do anything that I care about. So you just send it on, even though you've just seen one half of what I would consider the most powerful engine in the cube. So that preparation can be such a huge advantage in that realm.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this too, and it's not something that you're the most familiar with in terms of like the payoffs and like we're talking about like engines and that sort of thing, Cube Koga has a really cool function where a feature where you can just see past decks that people have played. You can even go into the event section and see past lists that people have played at Cube events. So if you're a little lost listening to this, I definitely recommend checking out those parts of Cube Koga and kind of seeing how some of the competitive decks are built, and you'll get an idea. You'll see some of the cards that we're talking about, and that might apply some context to that.
Spoilers for later in the episode. We'll talk about reviewing lists in more detail as well in just a bit. But so you've looked at your strategies, you've looked at your archetypes, your engines and payoffs, when different lines can work together, and what certain attackers might need to work, and what attackers might not be supported well enough in the cube to work, because that definitely happens. There are absolutely cases where an archetype just doesn't have the support that it needs to succeed, and so. Um, when you're past all that, that's the big stuff. There are some other things to consider. Weakness and resistance across the cube can be a big consideration. And this is especially important in low power with resistances. So low power, a really famous example is grass weakness or grass resistance is on so much stuff in the Gen 3 era, especially metal types. And so if you are playing grass, you need to be prepared for those grass resistant Pokemon, because in low power, if a Pokemon knocks 30 damage off your attack, that's like half your attack on your stage twos. And so you really need to be prepared for that, either with an effect that removes resistance or with a Pokemon that will be able to knock out those grass resistant Pokemon as a supporting Pokemon. And so that's really important in lower powers, but in higher powers, even so, the weaknesses of the cube can be a big deal, especially if you end up playing kind of an aggressive toolboxy deck, which have been very successful in many cubes. You want to be conscious of what weaknesses you want to aim for in the cube. So oftentimes, fighting is the most common weakness because dark and electric types and a lot of colorless lines are all weak to fighting. But in the same regard, fighting is often resisted as well by different types. And so that's something to consider. And weakness can enable you to build decks and tech more effectively for the decks that you might be weak to. Another example would be, let's say you're playing a fighting deck and you're psychic weak, then you would want to know whether the psychic line is weak to psychic or weak to dark, because a lot of the time it will be one or the other, it will be different between cubes. And so if you don't know which of those you are aiming for when you're looking for a secondary line or attacker, then you are going to be not equipped to build the best deck you could.
Yeah, I think especially in like the lower power levels too. Like I guess even in like high power, like weakness can be like a way easier way to get knockouts than others. But like especially in like lower power, like Nothing feels worse than like playing like the mono grass deck and then losing to the mono fire deck. So I think insulating yourself with like other attackers is a great way just to level up your play without having to do that much work. It's just kind of like thinking ahead and thinking about other like things that synergize with your deck that might be other types.
It is an interesting angle for any power level to build for that weakness, and so I definitely recommend for sure that people keep an eye on that. And also, lines not having weakness can also be an advantage. For example, Dragon in Rulebox Mutant, you really don't have weaknesses to contend with. You just need to get your line going, and so from that you would know, oh, if I'm in Dragon, then I just really build Dragon. I don't have to worry about partners. I don't have to worry about synergies. I just need to get this deck to be as strong as possible. So that's another thing to consider, and another place where weakness can be relevant. But moving on. We've talked some about synergies crossing lines and engines and payoffs, but just to draw a little bit more attention to it, it can be really easy to find engines within lines. So you have your fire starter Typhlosion, and then you have Charizard G level X, and Charizard G level X deals a ton of damage for a ton of energy. Typhlosion can supply those energy. Very clear path, very clear synergy there. But in cases where it can be less obvious, so Miss Magius and Unknown Y in Coin Flip Cube. I'm going to go back to that example. That is the most powerful acceleration engine in the cube for almost any deck. You generally don't want to play it in Typhlosion because Typhlosion already has excellent energy. That's kind of the identity of the line. But pretty much any other strategy in Coin Flip Cube is going to really appreciate that Miss Magius Unknown Y engine. And so that is the kind of thing that you want to be looking for. Maybe my slacking line does not have any inbuilt acceleration, but it's all colorless. So maybe I can steal acceleration from grass, or I can steal acceleration from fire, or maybe there's a Salamence line that I can take acceleration from. And then in a different regard, maybe my grass deck, it has an energy trans engine, which it moves grass energy around, so that's very obvious that you can use the grass attackers in that deck and be mobile in that way. But what you can also do with an energy trans deck, if the energy lineup for it is and when I say energy, I mean rainbows and Holin's Pokemon and things like that that give you multicolored energy. uh, you can build a toolbox deck that uses lots of different types of Pokemon for very powerful effects, or even just a couple of very powerful tech attackers. A famous one for grass energy trans decks is Latios Star, which has a grass energy cost in its attack. Then you can move on one grass energy, one Holin's Pokemon, and you have a fully powered attacker that can one hit knock out a ton of different stuff in the power levels where it's common. So there are a lot of things that might not be immediately obvious that and this is definitely something that will be easier with experience, because if you're a brand new cube player, then you're not necessarily going to be thinking about, oh well, is this one specific Pokemon that can power up this other specific Pokemon in the cube. It's not a connection you're going to have just going into it most of the time. But especially as you become more experienced, or if you're already very experienced, then you can look at the synergies that cross lines, or you can see what Pokemon there are. If you see that Latios Star, maybe you immediately go and look for Hoenn Pokemon, because you know that the Hoenn Pokemon will enable you to use the Latios Star with any of the three types of energy that it has, and increase its versatility and viability a lot. Whereas if there are no Hoenn Pokemon, and you go in assuming that there's the Latios Star, that there's the enablers for Latios Star, and then you get to the end of the draft and you're like, wow, I guess I just didn't see any Hoenn Pokemon. And suddenly you may have built a deck with a significant element of, oh, let's use this Latios Star to swing for big knockouts. And then there were actually no Hoenn Pokemon, so it wasn't enabled to the extent that you would need to anyway. And so crossing lines, synergies crossing lines, it's not something that we can kind of focus on as actively. It's definitely something that comes more with experience, but it's something that as a newer cube builder, cube player, you want to be thinking about, because if you start thinking about it, then you'll gradually get better at it over time. And I've also seen a lot of cases where people kind of write off lines. They're like, oh, this is not good. But then actually the way to make it good is just sitting somewhere else, and you just have to find that line, and you can make a really powerful deck out of it. Andrew, have you seen examples like that in the past? I'm sure you probably got some good ones.
Okay, so my favorite deck that I've drafted of all time is the Regigigas Golduck deck in your cube, the Archetype cube. Um, I think like the Golduck Break lets you basically have energy trans on any Pokemon. So being able to use that with the Regigigas Sacrifice, which is normally just used to like buff itself up and be able to attach energies to itself, but instead making it an accelerator and being able to transition that Pokemon with Golduck and even using the Golducks to give you a better fire matchup. That deck felt great because you had options into fighting because you had the Golduck, you had synergies with the Golduck Break, even just being able to move energy around, so you could really play other attackers. Like I remember playing Lucario SP to cover other Gigas. There's a lot of creative ways I think that you can find synergies with just like abilities that kind of like synchronize together that let you like utilize than other attackers. So that's an example for me that I always remember being really fun and a really like those pieces together just come together really well.
An excellent example. Yeah, that deck feels kind of iconically archetype cube to me, just because that cube is built with kind of that philosophy in mind of crossing lines to make your archetype, as opposed to just drafting a single line that is supposed to work in a self-contained way. And so, yeah, I think that Gigas deck that won the most recent Archetype Cube League was iconic to the idea of that cube and the idea of crossing lines for synergies that will then be powerful in other ways. So that is the third thing to consider when reviewing the cube list. One thing that we don't have on here on our show notes here, but that I want to draw attention to as well, is if you think a line is not enabled very well, then I always encourage you to check the trainers, because there are some cases, maybe the cube has a fire line that doesn't have any acceleration, like Charizard. It's a very common fire line that doesn't have acceleration. If the cube has two blacksmith and a welder, then suddenly Charizard's a lot more powerful than it would have been otherwise. And similar things with Aqua Patch, Metal Saucer, Dark Patch, Gardenia's Vigor. There are a lot of different trainer cards that can increase the viability of different lines. Rarely there would be any trainers that would decrease viability, but even stadiums that eliminate weakness or resistance, those can be a big thing. So that's just one other thing to consider when we're talking about evaluating viability and synergies across lines. But the last point that I have is just in assessing relative strength. And this is something that you kind of do throughout your evaluation. It isn't something that you should necessarily save and make a dedicated step, but you should be conscious when you're evaluating those first couple lines that you don't really know what other stuff is in the cube. So if you see a grass line and you're like, oh, this does 3 for 50, that sounds terrible, I'm not going to worry about that. But let's say it's in a low power environment and grass has the best acceleration, then that 3 for 50 that you can get off every single turn is potentially more powerful than the 3 for 70 that's on another line that doesn't have that energy. And so that is something to consider, is just assessing the relative strength as you go. Don't let your preconceived biases or ideas of what a power level or cube will look like affect your assessment of a cube. Assess the power of the cards in the cube against each other. That's the big thing that you want to consider as you go.
I think my favorite moment with that is when people draft Slower Card Cube and figure out that Magnezone, or not Magnezone, Bronzong has like good attacks, even though they're usually a support Pokemon. Like Metal Lynx has like a really efficient attack. So that's one of my favorite moments in that cube, is when people start utilizing the Bronzongs as attackers.
Yeah, I feel like in the beginning, people did not almost ever use the Bronzong as an attacking line, and nowadays I feel like the Bronzong is an attacking line almost as much as the Aggron. So
it's so good. It's good.
Very strong. Yeah, and the Aggron certainly has advantages. It's got a lot more HP. It's harder to knock out. It has some powerful attackers in the line, but the Bronzong is very efficient for what it does. So it's quite strong for sure.
So like that's one of those lines you look at, and it's like traditionally you're coming from even like, I guess it would be expanded now, but to me it always feels like standard. But like you see like a Pokemon with that ability, you kind of write it off as a support Pokemon, or not something I find a lot of value in. And this is like one of those things where like if everything's doing 3 for 60, Bronzong's doing 3 for 60, it's on rate and has an amazing ability. That's an insane Pokemon. So that's kind of a way you can apply some of this like relative strength. It's like if 3 for 60 is on rate, or like two shotting a lot of Pokemon in this cube, and it's a lower power cube, that's still going to be really strong, even though it's not a Pokemon that we're used to seeing as an attacker. It's all about context at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Another great example of cards that people look at and they kind of evaluate for the expected effect is Evo Shock Raichu. I've seen that card sneak into a lot of cubes where it probably doesn't belong. People see it and they think, oh, Evo Shock, that's a powerful ability, but it's not necessarily something I want to dedicate a whole line to. But Evo Shock Raichu has an attack that it deals 3 for 130 on a stage 1. And so suddenly that card is an incredibly powerful attacker in the right environment. Even in most high power environments, 3 for 130 is pretty strong. And so when you add that consideration to the card, suddenly you have to change the way you evaluate it. Tapu Koko Prism Star is another great example of that. I've seen it in some cubes where it is both a high HP basic with a solid attack, and it has the ability that will deny the prize and attach the energy. And so there are cases where people can kind of get carried away with the synergies that they're accustomed to in standard, where for a cube builder, it can impose some additional challenges, but it can also provide additional opportunities too, because there are instances where you can use cards in ways that they were not viable initially. So this can definitely be more common, I would say, for cards that are either very popular in cube if you play a lot of cube, or were powerful in standard, because then you have this very defined notion of what the card is, and it might not have the same identity in cube. And so when we consider all of these things, now, so let's say we've done all this. We've looked for the strategies and archetypes. We've checked for weaknesses and resistances. We've looked for synergies across lines, within lines. We've assessed the strength of everything. Now we need to decide, how aggressively do we need to draft? And this is something that I hear very little discussion about. I think this is one of the ways that I was really able to win this last Cube League, is because this was something that I was actively thinking about, and the way that I came up with to increase my odds of succeeding in the coin flip draft, which again is very challenging normally. Deciding how aggressively you need to draft is a very powerful thing for a drafter. This is also an area where I've failed in the past, especially in past champs cubes, where I have push too hard for an archetype when I didn't need to do that. Maybe that archetype was 10% better than the rest of the decks, but 10% better, unless it's open, is not going to be better than a different open strategy. And so Champs 2, I remember, had a draft that was recorded and might be on YouTube. But I had prepared in advance with a couple of other players, Mike being a notable one of the other players I prepared with. We all went in with this deck that we had in mind, which was Weavile Lucario. So using Special Dark Energy to make Lucario more powerful. Lucario was already a fairly aggressive line, but the Dark Energy would speed it up, and it would give it that little bit, or that additional top end. And so that was a deck that we went in with the idea of. And really, that deck was really good. It was very strong, but it wasn't that much better than the other cards in the cube. And even the deck that Mike ended up winning with, it didn't really do anything unintended. He just had an excellent version of that draft. And so I super focused on that archetype, and I ultimately had a much worse draft for it. I didn't do very well in that champs at all. And so on the flip side, the champs where I really realized, and the reason why I keep using champs is because I do more prep for champs than any other cube, so I feel like that's where I have my big preparation breakthroughs. The one where I really kind of had this revelation of approaching drafts in a different way depending on how the cube is built was the Delta Mutant Champions cube. I was going in with this preparation. I'm like, what strategies do I want to be aware of? What do I want to gun for? Do I think anything is really powerful? And I looked at the list and I got to the end and I said, This cube is really balanced. I know how I can make basically any deck work, and so I'm just going to let the deck come to me. And I did, and ultimately I ended up in the very powerful psychic deck that I was able to win with. And the flip side of that is coin flip cube, this most recent time, where I actually went through and I counted up the number of strategies that were in the cube that I thought could win. And coin flip is interesting because a lot of strategies cross lines, and so it's not necessarily, there are 16 lines and 16 strategies. It's like there are 16 lines and maybe 10 strategies, and I don't think three of those are good enough to win champs. And so, or at least reliably good enough to win champs. And so actually, there are 7 strategies and there are going to be 8 players, and all of them know the strongest strategies in the cube. So I'm going to have to take the strong Pokemon and the strong enablers very aggressively because otherwise I might not see them. And so these are all different examples of how you may choose to change the way you're drafting based on the contents of the cube. And so we're going to talk about the ways that you can decide how aggressively or non-aggressively you want to draft. And so,
Yeah, I think like I think like following that line too, it's important to consider that like your drafting strategy might and could be different going into every different cube. I think a lot of players, especially when they're kind of starting to get like the fundamentals down of like, when do I take cards, like and if that's where you're at, that's cool. Like, definitely like it's important to learn drafting fundamentals, but I think also once you've kind of gotten past that point, and you feel like you're drafting like pretty good decks, like I would definitely start considering like what Connor's talking about, where we're looking at cubes and that and contextually and saying like, okay, how aggressively do I need to start taking lines, or what is the balance of this cube? So I think there's definitely something to be said, like learn the drafting fundamentals first, and then as you start to level up, then start applying kind of like these principles too.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely, I would say, one of the highest level pieces of advice that we'll talk about in this episode is, most people who are successful drafters, they can evaluate a cube pretty well. They can look at a cube, they can decide what's strong, they can decide what they want to go for. I think maybe even high level cubers don't often see all of the different strategies in a cube, and so people can be surprised by some of the things that other players pull together. I know I've definitely had instances of that occur to me, and so but these are all familiar concepts, at least to some extent, for experienced cubers. But the way that you conduct the draft, I think, is something that has very little coverage up to now. So there are really 3 things, and I would say 2 things. 3 things on the list, 2 things if you're really playing a competitive event and your goal is to succeed, that you want to be considering when you talk about draft aggressiveness. And this is, number 1, is how is the balance of the cube? If you are going into a highly balanced cube environment, then that means that most or all strategies are going to be able to win. You just need to build the best version of whatever strategy you decide to play. And so these are, a lot of the time, these are the very best cubes, the ones where you can go into the cube and you can really just kind of let the draft come to you because you know that all of the lines are balanced well, and that if you just build a good version of the powerful deck, then you can succeed, you can win. On the flip side, and then actually, I guess before I get too far away from that, it can be easy to end up in a situation. I know when we talked about Delta Mutant and some of the higher player counts, like 9 or 10, there were some people who basically just said, okay, just take the first engine you find, just the first engine you can see, because you don't know if you're going to get one, so just take it and then use that to influence the rest of your draft. And I disagreed with that. I didn't necessarily think that that was true, specifically because Delta Mutant is balanced exceptionally well. Every single type and archetype in that cube can win very easily if they're built the right way. And so, you don't have to go super aggressively for the engine. There are enough engines in the cube for more than 10 people to have a strong deck. And so just kind of wait for the engine that people are the least interested in, and then you can have a significant advantage in those super high player count drafts. So that's one more tangible example of how a well balanced cube can enable you to draft in a different way. And a lot of the time, you'll see people who draft what I would say in a way that is safe or relatively safe at least. I think I'm going to pick on two players here because they are very successful, and so I feel better picking on them a little bit for it. But Blue and Mysterious Player, they are players who have succeeded very well in different cubes, lots of different environments, but they both draft in a way that is pretty safe. They Mysterious Player especially prioritizes consistency really strongly. Blue kind of waits to see what lane is open before investing in, and kind of waits a while a lot of the time. Really wants to make sure they're in that open lane. And so um, the risk with that, and when you're playing a balanced cube, that is a fantastic strategy. Because you can just go for the consistency and then fall into whatever deck you find. You can wait a long time before you start taking your eventual key pieces for your deck because there are lots of them for you to take. But going over to the flip side, when a cube is not balanced quite as well, and I'm not even saying when a cube is balanced terribly, and we'll talk about that too, but I'm talking if a cube is not quite as balanced, let's say, 1 in 5 lines is not as powerful, or maybe 1 in 4, so 20-25%. I wouldn't say a cube that has 20 or 25% of weaker strategies is poorly balanced, but it isn't balanced quite as well. So before I get into that, I want to pass it back to Andrew. Andrew, what have your experiences been with balancing, or with drafting different cubes that have kind of different levels of balance or different maturity in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see a lot of different balance when it comes to teams. If anyone's not familiar with the teams events, it's a group event where 3-on-3 players will draft, and 3 of them are one team, 3 on the others. We're all playing individual decks, but we strategize together. We always look at balance when we're going into these teams, and our draft strategy I think always changes from cube to cube. It just always kind of depends on what lines we think are available. I can't think of like lines off the top of my head as far as like balance, like imbalance, but I know we've had several times where we're like, okay, we've identified like 3 of these decks or 4 of these decks are just like uncontestedly more powerful. So like the draft strategy then takes like, okay, one of us has to get one of these lines, or like where if we see like a certain like enabler and it's like broken. I know there's an example out there, but I cannot think of it right now. But like that's kind of the idea.
Beedrill is a really famous example of kind of what you're talking about. Like a Beedrill,
like the line itself, or
a Beedrill line with mass attack.
Yeah, so that's the 30 for each Beedrill, right? Yeah, so that one can be like a hate draft each Beedrill or get each Beedrill, in that kind of situation if it's that powerful. Like Gyarados, the one that like from I think Diamond and Pearl, like with Magikarps, is a popular one that I remember. So stuff like that where it's a clear like if you know that certain lines are going to be just way overpowered, you want to prioritize stuff that either is hate drafting or getting into that line yourself. Where there's other times where we drafted cubes and we're saying like, okay, well, everything in here looks really good, so I mean just draft a good deck. And like that's kind of like the best feeling, honestly, when you're looking at a line and you're like, okay, I can just I don't have to prioritize. Like we looked at the Crack-a-Pack and we looked at like the Blacksmith and like the Cargo and like the Sycamore, like all these good consistencies, and then a really powerful card. Well, if Fire is like the most broken card, like the broken archetype in the cube, and it's a really easy to come together with that Blacksmith, and the cube's not well balanced, which Blue Cheesecake's cube is pretty well balanced, so that's not an issue there. But like if it wasn't, you would prioritize stuff like Blacksmith earlier, because you would say like, okay, well if I'm going to play like the broken 3-0 deck, then I might as well just prioritize the card that brings that whole deck together. If there aren't other decks to choose from. So it is kind of like it is a balancing act in a way where it's like, okay, how many decks do I have to pull from, and like can I reliably get into a good archetype if I draft the hard way, or rather do I need to prioritize getting into like one of the 4 good decks in this cube if I expect to win, if I'm thinking about a champs cube setting.
Yeah, talking about the team draft dynamic was interesting because it kind of adds a level to this discussion of balance and how aggressively you need to draft. A lot of the time, I think a lot of the top teams have kind of identified that this is a strong way to draft. Is if you're playing a cube where There are a few lines that are significantly more powerful. This is more common in teams than it is in other events, just because the balance criteria for teams is not quite as strict by design. Then you kind of put a hit out on those lines. You kind of say, okay, well, we need somebody to, we can say this person is going to go for this type. This person is going to go for this type. This person's going to go for this type. And you're not necessarily saying you're going to try and force that deck. You're saying you're either going to get that deck or you're going to really hurt the player playing that deck. And when you essentially put each person in the draft on one type, you can guarantee that your players are not going to hate draft each other, or at least increase the odds that your players are not going to hate draft each other. So that's another thing to consider. But to build off of what you were saying and getting into the other side. So we've talked about the super balanced cubes. Andrew talked about some cases where cubes are less balanced and how that might change your draft. And so to build off of that, if there are strategies in the cube that are significantly stronger or weaker, then that will change the way that you draft as well. And this is something that you really want to know in advance. This is not something you want to find out in the draft. These are very much the cases where you get to the end of the draft and you feel like you have a good deck, and then your opponent rolls up with something that deals 50% more damage for the same requirements, and you're just confused. You don't know what happened. And so this is a key element of preparation. And so a really infamous example, I would say, this is an old one. I feel like we didn't even have this draft in the Cube server. Maybe we had it somewhere else. I don't remember the specifics of it, but essentially, Mysterious Player and I were drafting with a bunch of players who had basically never drafted before, or very rarely drafted before. And we were playing a cube that had never been drafted before. And he and I think, looked at the cube and basically had the same thoughts. So it was a mid-power cube. And it had Diving Draw Empoleon and Magnezone Prime. And so it was very easy to look at the cube and look at those lines and just say, okay, if you're not on one of these lines, you're going to lose to one of these lines. So he ended up on one. I ended up on the other one. I don't remember which was which, but I know he beat me. So he probably ended up on the Magnezone side just because of weakness. And that's kind of an infamous example, but you can apply that in practice. If you're looking at a cube and there is a single attacker or card that is just far and away more powerful than the rest, Pokemon is a game where you have to go through the active Pokemon. This is a big challenge to balance versus other cubes and other card games. But it is also an advantage to some extent because you end up with these really consistent, intricate strategies that are not something you could pull off in other card games. That aside, the balancing issue is if there is one Pokemon, one topper that is just much more powerful than all the other toppers in the cube, then you just take that and you build around that single card. And that is an effective way to win. It's a really easy way to break cubes. It was much more common in the early days. Now people have a better eye for balance. People are thinking more about their balance. And so it's something that people are more aware of. But it does still happen, especially in teams. So Rulebox Mutant, I think, is an exceptionally well-balanced cube. But I know, Andrew, you and I both discovered that Garchomp EX was a little bit too strong the hard way when we had a rough time into it in our last team's draft of it. And ultimately, the Garchomp EX was removed, and the champs run of that cube was fantastic. And so, no discredit or anything like that. But I think that's a tangible example of a case where a single card is incredibly powerful, and you can build around that one card and make an extremely powerful deck because of that.
Yeah, actually, I put that in the back of my mind. I completely forgot about Garchomp, that one run, and I think that is a prime example of like relative strength and it being way more efficient than other cards in the cube, which then creates a problem where you're like, okay, well, if I just have Garchomp, I can just pair it with pretty much anything, and it's going to be effective. So when you're looking at cubes like that, and you see a card that is clearly like above the rest, and it's going like Magnezone Prime or Empoleon or other examples like Connor just mentioned, like those are kind of the standouts that you're looking at and you're saying, okay, well, if I just have this one card, then my deck is already better than my opponent's. So And that's something you want to know going into the draft. And I think that's where kind of looking at the cards and what cards are available. And like you see stuff like that, take note because you might see that in your opening pack or your first couple packs. And well, there might be a Sycamore or a Cargo in there. If that card like is going to make your draft like the best at the table, that it's probably worth considering taking.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you can go a little bit farther with this as well. So, okay, we've looked at the balance. Not, it's not poorly balanced. There's not any standout crazy card that is just way better than the rest. But the other thing that you really need to think about is, are there lines that just don't quite measure up? Um, I think coin flip is an example of this, where phenomenal cube, super fun, and for the most part very well balanced as well. But there are a couple of lines in the cube that I think maybe Al has struggled to kind of get quite up to the level of a lot of the more powerful strategies. And so when you look at a cube, most cubes will have lines like this, except for the absolute best balanced ones, where they're just not quite up to the level of the others. And so that is a situation that you can really improve your odds of avoiding by preparing in advance and looking at the cube in advance, is just knowing, okay, the Lipard line in this cube. It has some powerful stuff it can do. I see all these neat synergies, but a lot of the attackers in the cube, 80 damage is not that high. It can be knocked out very efficiently, and 3 energy is kind of a lot to assemble every time. So there are tons and tons of cases like this in many cubes, where there are just a line or two where you kind of, they're not quite there yet. The cube builder is still trying to get them to the same level as the rest of the cube, and be a little bit more powerful. And so the you kind of want to avoid them if possible. But I would say, don't take this to an extreme. I've definitely seen some players who are like, oh, I would never even consider drafting half of the lines in this cube, because I think they're, again, I'm going to go back to that 10% number, but I think they're weaker than the others. But then the actual difference there is 10%. So let's say the best line is 110% and the worst line is 90% of the cube's power level. If you have an extremely strong 90% deck and somebody has a somewhat shaky 110% deck, then you can very easily overcome that 110% deck. We've seen it many, many times before. And sometimes even that changes people's perspective on what those percentages are. So some people will go into a line. I know I actually had a conversation recently where somebody said, oh, fighting is bad in Delta Mutant. And I thought that was just ridiculous, because the fighting is just a line you have to build differently. It doesn't have inbuilt acceleration, so you've got to either get the energy from special energy or think about how you're going to be bridging big attacks, and you have to build it differently. But the payoff is, fighting is an extremely powerful line in Delta Mutant if you build it right. And so that's one of those examples where don't let your preconceived notions kind of get too extreme, or don't, if you see a line that you think is a little bit less powerful, don't immediately write it off, because there oftentimes, even if a line is just a little bit weaker, are lots of ways that you can still build it and make a really effective deck. So that is balance. Balance is a big part of Cube, but there are lots of different ways that knowing the balance of the cube in advance can influence how you draft. And so moving on to the second thing, this is a basic thing, but also kind of a difficult thing to get to intuitively. And that's, how many strong decks are there in the cube? And I'm not talking about lines necessarily. I'm talking about decks, archetypes. If your deck that is powerful needs multiple lines to come together, then that is something that you need to consider. And so I'm going to go with two really extreme examples here. So both excellent cubes, no discredit to the builders whatsoever. So going back to Coin Flip Cube, that was one in Champs where I decided that there were fewer archetypes that could win the draft at the table than there were players, and so I knew I had to go very aggressively there. The flip side, so when we drafted Slower Cube for Champs, Slower Car and I got together We did a bunch of prep. We basically talked out all of the strong decks that we could come up with, and we came up with a doc of like 50 decks that could win the event. And so that actually, I think in some respect that like hurt us a little bit because I don't think either of us ended up with a exactly the deck that we wanted. I mean, it's very hard to end up with a deck that you exactly the deck that you want in Slower Cube just because it is so fluid. Like people mix and match stuff constantly, and so but knowing that there were all those decks meant that we probably could have conducted the draft in a little bit of a different way than at least than what I did. I know I didn't draft that cube as well as I could have for sure, but the extreme variety in Slower Cube means if you have like your couple of good enablers or build arounds, then like you can get there. You can make a deck that will make it work. And you also know what cards to look out for. So if you're playing the Blaziken deck, you know to look out for Lugia EX. You know it's in there, and things like that. That's not really talking about aggressive drafting, but it's just a drafting note in general, kind of going back to the cross-line strategies. But the result is Slower Cube. You can draft it a little bit more passively. Now, Slower Cube is a very odd example because it's a super unique cube. There are a lot of really strong cards that kind of hold together less powerful attackers, and it works very well. But once you have your enabler, you can go in a lot of different directions in Slower Cube, and so in that case, you might very aggressively go for like one or two cards, and then fall back and chill out and take it a lot easier from there. But in something like Coin Flip, you really need to secure that archetype, and of course after this episode goes out, any of these cubes might change. And so these specific examples that we talk about here are more for reference, not for how you should approach cubes in the future. But how many, just a raw number of strong decks can influence the way that you draft significantly. And also, if this is an example of Slower Cube where you end up with a really odd situation where you need to go for one card really aggressively and then you can go much more passively for the rest. So say, for example, in Slower Cube, Firestarter Blaziken enables, like, let's say 12 of our 50 decks that we talked about. And so if we see the Firestarter Blaziken, slam that, now we can ease off. Now we know that there will be something for us at the end of the day. We don't have to go super aggressively for it. And so that's another thing, 100% prep. It's something that you would not be able to understand intuitively. You could luck into it, but you wouldn't know that going in. So moving on, the last thing that I want to talk about here is the personal preference angle, and I think that it is difficult or maybe even impossible to totally separate yourself from personal biases in draft. But and it's what strategy do you want to play? What sounds fun to you? For the most competitive environments, generally, Champs is the peak of competition in Pokemon Cube, but I think Cube League is another really competitive environment where you want to draft in as unbiased a way as you can. And I think this is a place where even some very powerful, very successful players have struggled in the past. You want to separate yourself from, so I personally love drafting Dusknoir. So if I was just drafting a cube for fun, then it's all fun. But if I was just like at an 8-person table or whatever, then I might second pick a Dusknoir just because I want to play Dusknoir, and that would change the way that I draft completely. I'm not necessarily trying as hard as I possibly can to win. I'm still not trying to lose, but the Dusknoir line just sounds fun to me, and so you don't want to let that become your norm if your goal is to win, if your goal is to succeed. And I think a lot of the case with some of the play and draft tips with our podcast, Andrew, is that we want to give the people who are really trying to level up their cube game the tools to do so. And so this is kind of the audience that we talk to. removing bias can be a very powerful thing in the way that you draft. And the better you get at doing that, the more likely you will be to build the best deck you possibly can. Andrew, I know there are lots of examples of personal bias in draft that we could call on. Do you have any that stand out to you?
I mean, I think about personal bias, and I always think back to like OG Gen 7 Cube. Like I'm talking like 2020. And like everybody and their mother wanted to draft Decidueye. Um it was actually insane how fast that line was going. Now Decidueye is a great card. But like, and I think this might also play on the fact that if you know other people have a similar bias to cards, like to consider, but like, um, when you're sitting at a draft and like you're looking at certain cards and like everyone wants that one card, you can like you gotta be realistic and think like, okay, well, maybe like speculating on like a Dartrix isn't gonna get you very far. Or if I'm taking one Decidueye, how likely am I to get these other ones to come together? I know like personally, like I really enjoy I mean, I really enjoy decks like the Gigas deck that like I love energy trans. I love abilities to make toolbox decks like that. But I think sometimes like they aren't always like the most consistent in cubes. So like I always have to it depends on I guess like goal, like if I'm sitting down and what I'm doing. But like if my goal is to win, I think it's removing like personal bias in a way that you're saying like, okay, well I'm kind of content with whatever is going to be the most like powerful I can get. And sometimes you don't get to take Decidueye. Sometimes you have to be more constrained and let it wheel or let it go in order to get a more consistent deck. But I just remember like doing that draft initially. Everybody would take a Decidueye, and it's like, guys, we can't all have Decidueye. Someone's gonna have to give it up, or we're all gonna have like a 1/1 line, which isn't very
Oh my
good.
gosh, it's so true. And the Decidueye line, it was strong in that cube, but it wasn't powerful to the extent that you would need to force it. And at the I think the most powerful version of that cube was, or the most powerful version of the Decidueye deck was actually the Checkmate deck that I don't think exists anymore. But that was maybe a rare case where forcing the Decidueye could have been justified. But even still, yeah, it was absolutely a great example of personal bias influencing a draft. And that's something that I didn't talk about either was the influence of personal bias on the other drafters at the table. Um, in the same vein that you want to remove your personal bias when you're going into a league or a champs or whatever, um, the other players at the table will often do the same. For champs, I think that's especially true. People don't tend to have a ton of personal bias going in. But this is really true of more casual tables. If you know that a certain player just loves to draft a very specific type of deck or a very specific line, then you can have some reasonable assurance that you will face competition for it at some point. And so that's something to consider. It's usually not going to happen at the higher levels of competition, but like Andrew said, it definitely can. If there is a line that either sees a lot of buzz in the group and conversation leading up to the league, or if you just think kind of lends itself to people evaluating highly, and maybe you think that it's actually just in line with the rest of the draft, the rest of the cards in the queue, then you can avoid that and give yourself a better chance of getting into an open archetype. So that's something else to consider. But for the last point, Andrew, you started talking about this a little bit earlier. So we have started with the basics, we have reviewed the list. Now, the third thing is reviewing successful deck lists. And so, Andrew, you started on this, so I will pass it over to you to kind of continue on it.
Yeah. So I mentioned before, for those who are not as familiar with Cube Koga, it's got a lot of really cool features. Shout out to Best Paul Al, the designer of the website. But one of those features is, well, there's a couple of them, is that you could look at decks created on different cubes. So when we run Cube League or Teams or even Flash Cubes, as long as those lists are made public, which 99% of the chance they are, you can go and look. So if you look at even like I think like Blue 3 cube has like I think over like it has like a really high amount, and 83 decks already listed on on cube on Blue 3. And there's like a rating. Some people like rate some of the more memorable decks higher, so you can kind of see sort of what different iterations of the cube has looked like. But my point is, though, if you want to go look and see, well, what decks did people draft in this past Champions League? The stuff that Connor says sounds interesting. You want to check that out. You go onto the main page and you go to the events page. You can go ahead and look at both days of Champions League Cube. You can look at the deck list. So if you want to see Connor's deck that he drafted, or other decks like you want to see Zach, who is in the finals, they're all posted there. And you can apply this to any cube. If we're running whatever cube for Cube League and you want to just check out and see what decks people have drafted in the past, you can go and look. And it's a really cool way to see not only what do decks look like in, let's just say, a mutant cube, or what do they look like in a shop cube, but like what strategies are you seeing most common. So it can give you a lot of information in terms of what players tend to draft, what players tend to put together, and like decks that are common, and like can also tell you if you thought this line was really good, and if you're seeing it shown across different decks, that probably confirms that analysis there. So yeah, definitely something if you haven't checked out before, I will put links in our description, but a really powerful tool to look at deck lists.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Cube Koga assets there in terms of being able to look at past results are incredible, especially if you're looking at a cube that has been drafted in the past for like League, where all of the lists for League will be on Cube Koga. There's just such a great set of resources there. But a lot of the time when we do play a League, it's not going to be a cube that's been played for League before, and that's going to be the most common case where people really look to prepare for a draft. That and sometimes teams, but I think some teams prepare more and less. So League is the environment where the preparation can be the most effective. And so the couple of things that I want to talk about in terms of reviewing successful lists, in a lot of in most senses, the reviewing list is just, you see a deck, it did well, it's good, and you can do that, or something similar to that. Both successful and unsuccessful lists can be of value when you're reviewing previous cubes and previous runs. And the ways are different. So for a successful list, you can look at that and you can say, oh, hey, this is a way that this person was able to build this deck, this archetype, and they did well with it. They won. They went 2-1, whatever. So I know this is kind of like a proof of concept that this can work. On the flip side, when you look at unsuccessful decks, you really want to look at a couple of things. One, you want to look at, is the deck built well? So if a deck is built really well, if it has a great supporter base, good energy count, if it has the Pokemon pieces that it needs to succeed, and it went like 0-3, then that's a pretty big indicator that maybe that line is not as powerful as it could be, or as you were maybe hoping. On the flip side, if you see an archetype that you aren't super that didn't do super well, but it isn't built the best, you think, oh, they're missing a couple of key pieces, or their supporters are kind of sketchy or whatever, then that can be an indicator that maybe that archetype is still strong, and that one bad result is not indication that it is weak. So generally, I would say a rule of thumb is you can tell what decks are potentially powerful by their success, but it's hard to determine exactly what decks are not viable based on their failures. And then the last thing that I want to talk about here is keep an eye on interesting card counts or common card counts. If you notice a certain card or certain type of card is significantly more common in succeeding decks than others, maybe it's a certain supporter, or maybe it's a different engine or whatever, then that can be something to keep in mind as well. It's hard to draw. I don't have an example right off the top of my head, but if you see Lily's Full Force, which is a card that I think for a long time people considered not very good, it's not amazing, but it is better than people thought. you see Lily's full force in a winning deck, then maybe that card is worth playing actually, and maybe it's worth evaluating a little bit higher than you did normally. Or maybe you see a card like Enhanced Hammer in the lowest, or like you see a deck with 3 pieces of tool removal and it went 0-3, and normally you consider tool removal really powerful. Maybe that can be an indication that in that cube, tool removal is not quite as strong. And so those cases are a little bit harder to see and not as common, not as important really, but it can give you a little bit of an edge over other drafters.
I think something too in that line, if we're talking about interesting cards or counts, is energy, especially depending on the power level and the deck archetype. If you're someone who's struggling with certain archetypes, looking at the energy counts that players use, maybe they're playing a Delcatty Blaziken engine, and that's going to require more energy. Or maybe they're playing something that's pretty low cost, and kind of paying attention to how much energy that those decks are playing, and especially at the power level as well. Like how much space should I be dedicating to these things?
Definitely. It's like I said, it's a little bit of a smaller piece of the information that you can gain from previous lists, but it is something to keep in mind as well. And it can also reveal drafter biases. So if you know you're going to be drafting with certain people, Mysterious Player, for example, always has a very strong supporter line, and generally doesn't have a ton of techie stuff going on. So you can generally look at Mysterious Player's draft and say, okay, well, I think they're probably going to go for a really, a strongly consistent deck and prioritize that. And so things like that, they're, again, harder to pull out. But if you know you're going to be drafting with specific people in the future and you have their lists to reference, then sometimes you can derive something from those as well. In terms of the steps, the preparation process, that's pretty much all I've got. Andrew, do you have anything to add that we haven't talked about?
No, not really. I mean, this has definitely been a pretty exhaustive list of things to consider going into cube events. And I'd say if like I always think about players who aren't as familiar with these concepts yet, but are interested. If you made it this far, I mean, I think you're on the right track. Definitely, don't try to take the whole pie in one bite. Definitely break this up into pieces. There's a lot of different aspects here. I think any player who's trying to go from good to great, we have an episode about that as well. Even just focusing on one of these elements can level up your gameplay way more than what you might expect. All right, I think we've covered a lot already. So we're going to be moving to our conclusion segment. But if there's anything here that you found interesting or anything you'd like us to elaborate on, definitely give us a shout in the Cube Discord. We're always available. Let us know, what topics you want us to elaborate on. We'd love to be there for you. So stick around. We're going to be back in our conclusion segment in just a minute. All right, welcome back to our conclusion segment. So I did want to give a few updates in regards to the podcast and as well as my involvement with Cube. So I think Connor alluded to some of this in the Cube Discord. But we are coming back for a little bit. We kind of wanted to do like one last season of the podcast. And that'll result in about 2 episodes a month. So this will be the second episode you're getting in July. You can expect about 4 more episodes. So 2 more in August and then 2 more in September. Reason being, I mean, we both have a lot that we've learned and experienced with Cube since the podcast ended that we thought it'd be a great time to share that. But and how life works. I personally am kind of moving out of Cube a little bit, just kind of pursuing other things like competing and trying to progress my career. That I don't have as much time for Cube as much as I would love to. I still love the Discord. Still love all the people and obviously the activity itself. So, but I am taking a bit of a step back in terms of my involvement. But that is solely because of time and the just kind of reprioritizing things. So, I have stepped down as an admin, but I 100% love the work that Davi and the other admin teams are doing. And I just wanted to make sure that was known, that like that was totally my decision, and that they have been an awesome team. And it's been really great to support them. But I have kind of been taking a step back for getting ready for Worlds. So if you don't see me in the Discord, I've not gone. I've just been trying to focus up as I've been testing a lot to get ready. And that said, I still want to produce this podcast for a little bit longer. So we would hate to come back for one episode and then be gone. There's still so much to talk about. So you can expect about 4 more episodes up through September. So about 2 a month. So it's a bittersweet. I definitely love the ability to do this podcast. It's been really great to see everyone's interactions with it. And also just like sharing our thoughts on this format that means so much to both of us has been super cool. Obviously, this is the end, but I just want to make sure people are aware, and we want to keep you guys in the loop, especially people who've been listening who are excited the podcast are back. We're excited too. We're hoping to bring the next best 4 episodes to you that we possibly can.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's and we've talked about this outside of the episodes as well, just kind of the trajectory of the podcast. And I think that it'll be really nice to kind of put a conclusion on it, because before I don't think we were really planning for it to pause for such a long time, but it did. And so it didn't really feel conclusive. It just felt like it kind of stopped. And so with these 6 episodes here, it really gives us an opportunity to talk about some of the things that we've learned over the last few years and some of the things that we didn't cover before, and then also kind of put a more resolute cap on it, and just give it a little bit more closure than we had before. But to what Andrew said, this is I don't really play competitive Pokemon right now, and so I'm still super into the cube scene. Really excited to continue playing, and probably about as excited as I've ever been. I would say retiring from the ownership role of the group kind of did my enthusiasm some good, I think. But yeah, so very excited. I'll definitely still be around, and I'm sure I'll make content of different varieties in the future. But we wanted to put a nice kind of bow on the PCube podcast and produce a last few strong episodes, and then call it a day.
Yeah, and if there are any topics that you would like us to discuss, definitely let us know. Because like we're sort of figuring out our schedule and like what our topics are going to be, and we'd love to consider ones that the community wants us to focus on, especially while we have a couple more episodes left. So if there are any topics, either you can DM us, you can put that in the comments, you can put it in the media discussion channel. But just you guys listening and supporting the podcast means so much to us. We were both very I don't know, like we were so happy, like seeing everyone was so like excited about the first episode back, that it was really awesome. It was a lot of great moments we were sharing, and it just means so much to us that people after 3 years come back and listen, and leave some nice comments like that. That means a lot to us, and we greatly appreciate the support the community has always given us doing this type of content.
Definitely, the community response has just been amazing. Just looking at all the comments and people's discussion, and it's always great to see. I really love both engaging with the people and just seeing them kind of engage with the discussion itself in the episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So aside from the heavy stuff, what's new in your life, Connor?
I they
quick transition.
Yeah, there's this big Magic Online cube event where if you win a vintage cube, and then you win 2 more vintage cubes in a row, and then you win a 4th vintage cube in a row. So you have to go 12-0 over 4 drafts. And in Magic is a much higher variance game than Pokemon. So even if you draft the best possible deck you can 4 times in a row, you are very unlikely to win 12 matches in a row. So that all said, it's very cool, because if you do get to that very final stage, if you do win all those 12 matches, then they fly you out to Vegas for their Magic Con event, and you get to draft a vintage cube in person and keep all the cards. And they said that they had their vintage cube list evaluated by a professional, and it will be worth at least $65,000. So they're in Magic vintage cubes, they're all-time famous cards like Black Lotus and the Moxen and Time Walk, Ancestral Recall, and all that. So they will have real versions of those cards available for those 8 finalists to draft, and I think that is insanely cool. So even though I'm certainly not the very best vintage cube drafter in the world, and I don't expect to win. I think expecting to win, even if you were the best vintage cube drafter in the world, would be un. I think you would be doing yourself a disservice to expect to win. But it. I've been doing that. I played a couple of runs of that. Had one very close, and then a couple that were not so close. So I've taken a step back. It's running for a while. They're kind of determining qualifiers over the next several weeks, I think, and so maybe I'll run it back and try it again. But that's been really fun. The Arena Cube has been really fun. That is back now, and then but really, I'm really kind of itching to get back to Pokemon, and for the new Cube League season to start. And so I know the announcement is going up soon. I don't know if it'll be just after or just before this episode goes up, but very, very excited for that personally. And then outside of that, I don't know. I feel like those are my big things right now. Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, I had a question though. So about the magic stuff. Is it free or does it like cost money
So
or
to only
and like how many can you
only your
do?
first run costs money. So for the
Oh, interesting.
initial entry for that first draft, you have to go 3-0 in. It is $6, which is cheaper than their usual vintage cube entry. But the flip side is the rewards are different. If you don't win, like you have to go 3-0. If you go 3-0, you get the token that lets you go to the next stage. If you don't go 3-0, you don't get anything. Whereas their usual vintage cube setup is
Oh, okay.
basically for each win, you get half of the cost of entry back. So if you win twice, then you can play again for free. And if you win 3 times, you get another half of one. But on the flip side, if you go 0-3, then you're just out your entry. Which I think actually the normal vintage cube setup in Magic Online is pretty generous in terms of them being a business that has to make money. They basically give back all of the money that people put into it, and in to an extent, they make money off of it. It's not like it's a totally altruistic thing, but it's pretty favorable for the players, I would say. But yeah, so that initial run costs $6. You can do as many of them as you have time for within the allotted time period, basically. So it's not like you're limited on that. But then after that first one, then your number of entries are limited. So basically, you'll win like a qualifying token that takes you to the next round, and then
Oh, okay. So like is it like so $6 basically gets you at the start of your run and you have to go 3-0 to move on to the next phase, but if you lose that next phase, then you have to pay $6 to start another run. Is that kind of how it
so
works?
it's a little complicated. So basically, the first phase is what's called a feeder league. So it's not pod play. You just draft with your 8 people, and then you're released into the big pool, kind of like a gigantic cube league. Um, so so that's where you need to go 3-0, and then you get your token to the next phase. From there, the next phase of the draft starts like during the week, I think, or like during the weekend. I don't remember exactly. I have to look at the specifics again. But basically, the next phase does not happen immediately. So it's not as though you're trying to go 12-0 consecutively all at once. It's like you need to go 3-0, and then in the next one you need to go 6-0, and then in the one after that you need to go 3-0 again. So there's like a time delay between them, and the only one that you can enter without a token is that first stage.
I think I'm more confused now, but that's okay.
It's okay. Basically you pay six
It
dollars.
sounds like a
You
fun
pay six
event
dollars
though.
to enter, and
Yeah.
if you win, then you can keep going. And if you lose, then you'd have to pay $6 to enter again, with some caveats that if you get to like the second or third stage, then you can't just immediately re-enter those stages. You've got to start from the beginning again.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking. So you can if your first run doesn't go well, you can try again. That was like the thing I was like trying to
Yeah,
understand.
you
So that's cool.
can. It's
The
it's they kind of segment it out to make sure their number of qualified players is very regulated, but uh,
mhm.
but beyond that, you can basically try as many times as you need to.
Getting you talk about like the perks and like the event itself. Getting the cards you drafted is wild. I've thought about that from like how would I change the card, like my priority in drafting sometimes if these are real cards I got to keep them, like like you just take the Black Lotus, like
Yeah, and they haven't.
I mean Black Lotus is obviously like the broken card, but that's just
Yeah,
funny.
and it's interesting because they haven't talked about what the pricing is for that final cube, other than the players getting the cards. So if there is additional pricing, if you get 50 grand for winning that last leg, then you would just try and make the best deck possible. Rarity
Right.
be damned. But if you don't get anything else, like if the prize is just the cards, you should absolutely just take the most valuable thing you can every pick, because your pricing is right there.
Yeah, it's like a question of like, you know, expected value. So if I get more by building a good deck, then yeah, I should just build the best deck. But if I get more from just drafting the most expensive cards, then there you go.
Exactly.
That's such an interesting concept.
Well,
Is it streamed? Do
it
you
will
know
be, I
if they're gonna
think,
stream it?
yeah. And the
I might check that out.
the interesting, or there's another layer of interest to it, which is like, so for the Moxen and for Black Lotus and all that, the Power Nine, if you see that card, you're just gonna take it. Like you don't, it's
Yep.
already one of the best cards in the draft. And so you don't have to think that hard about, oh, is this the most valuable card in my pack? It's like, it's a Black Lotus. It's the most valuable card. You just take it. It's the best card. It's the most valuable card. Technically, if you want to really get into the weeds, a lot of the people that are really strong at Vintage Cube now consider Time Walk to be the best card in the cube. But we don't need to get into the super specifics like that. Basically, if you take a Black Lotus, you are both on the way to having a very good deck, and you are on the way to having a lot of money in your final card pool. And so, but where it gets interesting is like, so Soul Ring. Soul Ring is commonly considered to be probably the second or third best card, or probably the third or fourth best card in the whole draft. Soul Ring is like $5. So that's where it really gets interesting, because normally if you open a Soul Ring in Vintage Cube, you are as happy or even happier than if you were to open like a Mox Emerald or something. But in when you keep all the cards, your Soul Ring is, even if it's the very original print of Soul Ring, the value is not going to be anywhere near the value of a Mox. And so or even, there are tons of cards in the Vintage Cube that are 50, 100, $200, right? And so um you have to think about, okay, this Soul Ring this is the best card in the pack. It's one of the very best cards in the cube, one of the best things I could possibly take. But this random 3-drop that's like not even that good in Vintage Cube is like $150 in this pack. And so that is where you will really see conflicts of, do I want to win or do I want to cash? And I hope that they just haven't announced the pricing yet, and there will be pricing for doing well in that last phase, just because it will motivate people to draft well still, instead of just maximizing the money they can get.
Yeah, it'd be kind of lame if like these have like people who are, I guess, well, one, lucky, but also really good. Who are like, this is a really cool event. It just would like suck if they just don't draft like, like high skilled players. Like it's like, I mean, I wouldn't blame them, but like as the spirit of the event, I feel like you want them to, you know, do the good player thing and not just do like the thing that it generates the most like card value.
Right.
So, but we'll see. That'd be kind of fun to watch, though.
Definitely. Yeah, I'll definitely watch it. I definitely don't expect to be there, of course, even if I do sign up for another couple runs. But I think the general outlook for it is, you need to be at least solidly good, but you need to get incredibly lucky to get through to that last round, just because Magic is intrinsically a higher variance game than something like Pokemon. For the listeners who are not as familiar with Magic, it's hard to execute exactly the same strategy every game, which is exactly what you're trying to do in Pokemon and what decks are built to do, and that's just what Pokemon is as a game. In Magic, the variance from game to game is much higher, and so you have to get extraordinarily lucky. Even if you're the very best cube drafter in the world, you have to get extraordinarily lucky to make it to the last stage.
That's interesting. Yeah, not something I have experience with in terms of Magic. I don't really play, so I'm gonna defer to you on all Magic topics.
Yeah, if it was Pokemon, I mean, if the
uh,
Pokemon company is listening, then then if Pokemon did it, then I would be reasonably confident, I think, that given a few attempts, I could make the 12-0 happen. But Pokemon is a much lower variance game, so the it's much easier to do if you are at the top of the cube game than it is in Magic.
I guess stuff going on in my life. Not again, kind of similar thing. Getting ready for Worlds. I've been doing a lot of testing. Still excited to go. It's in about 3 weeks, so got quite a bit of time. Just working with the new cards that we're getting out of the Shrouded Fable set. So um, yeah, that'll kind of be that. And then we got band rehearsal every coming up now, so it'll be pretty busy next couple of weeks. But I'm looking forward to the outcome. It'll be a great outcome. Nothing is ever worth doing without some hard work. So definitely up for the task.
Of course, yeah. I know you've done the band stuff for quite a bit of time, and even when you were younger, before you were doing it professionally, you were basically doing it professionally. And so, yeah,
Yeah,
I think that what you've done there is really impressive. It's always cool to hear about.
well, I appreciate that. Yeah, this will be the second Worlds where I've had to test between band camps, so I've got some experience with this before. So this will be interesting, but I know it goes by really quickly. Uh, so it's definitely a good time. You see a lot of progress with the students. So we have a lot of rehearsals going on coming up. That's kind of where I'm talking about. But you see a lot of progress going on there, and then between that I'll be playing some Pokemon, and between all of that I'll be doing some podcasting. So a lot of different stuff going on, but it's all really cool stuff. So I can't complain.
Yeah, yeah, sounds like a busy time, but a good time. And we'll talk again before Worlds. I don't know if there'll be another episode. Yeah, there'll be another episode before Worlds, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
there should be.
Maybe. Oh, okay. So I'm getting it mixed up in my head. But yeah, so there'll definitely be at least one more episode before Worlds. So we'll definitely talk again before. And I think we'll record another episode before Worlds, but I don't know if it'll come out until afterwards. So we'll see. But yeah, definitely. I'm sure I'll say it multiple times between now and then. But definitely best of luck there. And I know you're working really hard for it. So hope that those that effort is returned in the outcome.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. We'll see what happens. I'm gonna do my best, but always can only walk away with what I can do. So whatever happens, happens. But I'll just put myself in the best spot. So I'm excited. I loved Worlds like 2019. I think like the competing with different like countries was always really cool, and like I feel like you get some of that at the IC, but they're so big these days, and a lot of them are gonna be from like America or Europe, that you don't really get to compete against like Asia as much, or Australia to an extent. So I always find these to have a really diverse array of opponents, which I think is cool, and get to guinea pig the new tournament structure. So that'll be fun too. I think it'll be a huge shake up there with the point changes and everything.
The new tournament structure is that in effect for Worlds? Wow.
Yep,
Okay, so
that'll be the first tournament.
that'll be a big change then. Just because the player base at Worlds is not that big.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at it recently. I want to say it's an eight round day one, given the amount of people that are in the tournament, because it's like pretty high amount of people need to be in there. I think it's like 2,000 for the 9 round, so it'll be like a 6-2 situation. Um, which honestly, I played in 2019 when it was the grinder. I'm kind of looking forward to this structure more than the last one because having to like, I think you just like, it felt like the same thing. You just couldn't tie on day one worlds, but it was like you play until like you're like eliminated essentially, like you get like a certain record. Or this feels more like just a traditional tournament, and it's like okay, part of me just likes that better. Or it's like I'm more familiar with this than just like okay, you gotta like go 5-0 or whatever, or get the X amount of wins, and then change your deck in day two. This is more of like a traditional tournament.
Yeah, I think the 2 day structure, as I'm sure I'm heavily biased here, but as somebody who deals with a lot of fatigue when playing long tournaments like Pokemon has, the previous 2 day structure where a bunch of people had to play in day one, and then a handful of people did not have to play in day one, and they just started in day two. Of course, the idea is that the players who start in day two are the best players in the game, and so they will be more inclined to do better than than day one players would on average. But I think that there is a real element of fatigue that comes from having to play through all of day one and then having to come back and play day two, especially against people who are just totally fresh, who haven't had to play 10 hours of Pokemon the previous day.
Yeah, so I'm optimistic. I think it'll be a good event. I'm really looking forward to see what everyone has cooking. But time will tell. Quite a bit of time between now and then, though, which I'm thankful for because I need all the time I can get to test. But there's not really anything else going on, so I'm really curious like how online events might evolve. I don't know. Like I just don't know what to expect. Like people are gonna have like a lot of time between now and Worlds to like refine stuff, myself included. So I have no idea what to expect in terms of like where decks are going to be, but I think that'll make it cool.
Definitely from a spectator experience, which is where I'm going to be coming from this year, and probably most years into the future, if not all of them. Um, the the innovation for Worlds is always really fun to see. I know that it can be challenging from a player perspective to both try and be the one to come up with the thing that wins the event, but then also have to contend with the other people who have potentially also come up with the thing to win the event. And so, from a spectator perspective, it will be a lot of fun.
Anything else that we want to cover before we conclude this episode? I know this has been not our longest episode by far, but definitely it's been a lot we've gone over.
No, I think I'm all good. I definitely agree. It feels like it's been a longer one just because it's been very information dense. But no, I feel good.
All right. Well, if you're listening to this and if you have any topics you want us to cover, please do let us know. Because we would love to, if there's a community interest over this topic, we'd love to cover it. But with that said, leave us comments, anything, other thoughts you have on this episode. If you made it this far, again, you're the real ones. We appreciate you. So, that'll do it for us in this episode. Make sure to tune in next time. We'll see you later.